In the winter of 1775 and 1776, a man by the name of James Pike sat down in his cabin or house or whatever it is that he lived in and began to carve a new powder horn. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, the powder horn is where you hold your gunpowder, which you then pour into the pan for the magazine. Not the magazine, it is the magazine on the musket. And you put the flint in there. The hammer goes back. The flint strikes the hammer. The hammer strikes the flint lights the gunpowder. The gunpowder blows up and spins the musket ball, flying towards the British. James Pike was an American. He was a colonial. He was a patriot. And he's a man who believed in the idea of liberty. And so he felt the need to go into the New Year's campaigns with a new powder horn. He spent a good deal of time on that powder horn. If you're looking at the video, you can see the intricacy of the lettering. And on the other side of it, he drew and engraved this picture. On the left are the British regulars with their muskets raised. And in the middle of the drawing, you can see the musket ball in flight that he believes that the British fired first. And on the right are the provincials, the colonials, the militia, the men who stood at Lexington and Concord. And the bullet is flying towards them, the musket ball. And in the middle of all of this is the depiction of, and it's even labeled as, the Liberty Tree. This is an idea that we don't really understand about the framers and the founders of this country, this concept of liberty. Remember that in 1775, as well as in 1787, liberty is the issue, both in the Revolution and in the creation of the Constitution. How do we win our liberty, and how do we best protect said liberty? This idea of the Liberty Tree, of course, is something that is deeply ingrained in American psyche, although, again, we've forgotten much of it. The original Liberty Tree in Boston, where once upon a time was hung in effigy the tax collector, the person who agreed to collect the stamp tax, along with a boot full of propaganda and the like, explaining why this was a bad idea. The tree would go on to become literally one of the earliest symbols of the United States of America. It was placed upon banners and displayed prominently and proudly. An appeal to heaven, it was called, because the tree points to heaven. And these flags would be flown literally everywhere that there was to fly them. Long before there was the Stars and Stripes with our 13 stars, there was the Liberty Tree and the Liberty Tree flags that were literally everywhere to be found. The concept of liberty is one that, again, today we don't really grasp what it means. And I've said this for years. You can go back to my radio show. This is something I've been talking about for 20 years, I think. This idea of the difference between liberty and freedom. They are not, particularly in English, the same thing. They come from different words. They come from different languages. And they have different implications. And yet combined, they're like words and music. That's one of my favorite movies, Eddie and the Cruisers. They're words and music. Together, in English, they become even more powerful. In English, freedom and liberty literally become e pluribus unum, out of many one. There is so much depth to these two words and their meaning and their understanding that we have lost along the way. And in fact, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because this isn't what this is about, but it's just a point to remind you that the American Revolution was not fought for freedom. We had freedom. What we did not have was liberty, which is the implication that we have the right, the blessing of self-determination, both as an individual and as a corporate entity, whether that's our neighborhood, our family, our city, our town, our dwelling, our nation. Those are the things that were actually being fought for, because those are the things that were actually being denied. It wasn't necessarily freedoms per se. It was liberty. Today, these ideas are synonymous. We throw the word around, politicians throw the word around because they don't understand the difference. They don't care to even know that there's a difference between the two. But the founders of this country fought for liberty. That's what they were fighting for. And the framers, when they sat down at the convention in 1787, and in the post-convention debates, the ratification debates, in which the Federalists and Anti-Federalists argued vehemently about the Constitution's benefits and its dangers and those sorts of things, what they were really arguing about was, what is the best way to secure liberty? What is the best way to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? Is it the Articles of Confederation for perpetuating the Union as they were operating under, or was it the Constitution, which, as proposed, wasn't in place yet? It's important to remember that the convention was called not to write the Constitution. To call it the Constitutional Convention is something of a misnomer. It was called to propose changes to the Articles of Confederation because they were having problems with that and it wasn't working very well. But at the end of the day, the real and really the only question on the table after September 17th, 1787 is, which of these two methods of governing is the best for preserving our liberties? Now, this is an important question because, as Brutus will point out, quite cogently, I think, perhaps this country never saw so critical a period in our political concerns. We have felt the feebleness of the ties by which these United States are held together, and the want of sufficient energy in our present confederation to manage, in some instances, our general concerns. Various expedients have been proposed to remedy these evils, but so far, none have succeeded. Even the Anti-Federalists recognized the fact that the Articles of Confederation were very weak, and they were very problematic. And of course, again, without spending a lot of time on it, the biggest problem with it was that literally any one state could stop anything, looking at you, Rhode Island, and that was creating problems. There were issues with how the states related to one another, how they managed things. And in the end of all this, we ended up with this Constitution as proposed. As the woman on the street asked, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? A republic, madam, if you can keep it. And we talked a couple episodes ago about that not really being the case. And we're going to delve a little bit more into that. Brutus, the writer of the Anti-Federalist papers, the Brutus papers, understood that this entire argument had huge stakes in it, that this was not just some political argument about who should be in charge or, whether or not we should have a dollar or a shilling. This wasn't any of that. He understood that there was so much more here. He understood that if the Constitution offered to your acceptance, the people's acceptance, is a wise one, and it's calculated to preserve the invaluable blessings of liberty, there's that phrase again, to secure the inestimable rights of mankind and promote human happiness, then, if you accept it, you will lay a lasting foundation of happiness for millions yet unborn. Generations to come will rise up and call you blessed. But if, on the other hand, this form of government contains principles that will lead to the subversion of liberty, if it tends to establish a despotism, or what is worse, a tyrannic aristocracy, then if you adopt it, this only remaining asylum for liberty will be shut up, and posterity will execrate your memory. It's a good word. Execrate means to condemn your memory. So what really was the issue here? At its core, there are a couple of things that are really going to weigh in on this. There are a lot of things we're going to argue about. We're going to argue about courts. We're going to argue about Congress. We're going to argue about, legislative presidencies and that sort of thing. But there are really two issues here. One is this a republic, as Franklin has said? And the second question is going to be, why is there no Bill of Rights in all of this? And we'll get to that at a later date. This idea of republic is understood, as we talked about, differently to Americans in 1787. It is a fact that most Americans understood the republic, meaning any republic, in Montesquieuian terms. Now, Montesquieu, as we talked about, a French philosopher of the 1730s and 40s, the early part of the 1700s, who had written a book that had been translated into English. And again, America, a very literate country. Virtually everybody in America had read or understood these ideas. This is what they believed they were creating. But Montesquieu had some ideas about what a republic should be. Number one, his overwhelming belief was that a republic had to be very small, both physically and population-wise. Now, this is going to create some blowback from Hamilton, particularly in Federalist 9, because he's going to point out the fact that the states are even too large by Montesquieuian definition, although you could make an argument because they're small. They're not huge countries. Well, be that as it may, he believed that physically the population had to be very small. The reason for this was it would protect democracy because he defined virtue as the love of equality. And in a small group like that, everyone understands and knows everyone else. And so you're protecting that liberty because you're all equal. You understand everything the same. You understand what's going on. He believed that the culture and the history of the people in the republic had to be identical. It had to be homogenous, which is a word I really like and tend to overuse. But he didn't believe in, absolute, everybody had to be the same, but you had to have the same general idea of things, culturally and historically. He is not a fan, Montesquieu is not a fan, nor was Plato a fan of diversity in a republic. Both of them believe very firmly that diversity leads to problems when it comes to virtue and love of equality. And maybe there's something to that. He also believed that the religion of the republic had to be absolutely, there's that word again, homogeneous. It had to be the same. Now, again, this is a view of a republic to us today is bizarre because we don't think of it in those terms. We think of that in those terms as diversity, in particular in religion and culture and those kinds of things, are strengths of a republic as opposed to weaknesses in a republic, which is absolutely anti-Montesquieuian, which is exactly what that woman on the street thought too when she asked Franklin that question. And so his answer is just really strange. It's true that in America we had in the 1700s separated ourselves primarily on religious grounds. In some parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, the Puritans held sway. They were, I'm not going to go into religious descriptions here, but the Puritans, Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter, or Oliver Cromwell and that group. They had come, the Pilgrims who came to America in 1620 were Puritans. You had the Quakers. Quakers, of course, the large state of Pennsylvania. They had their own views of things, and they had, to this day, a great influence on things, primarily being pacifists and the likes of that. In Virginia, you had the Anglicans, who were the Church of England, who, even though they were Americans, still worshipped as Englishmen, and they had, as part of their enforcement elements, the so-called Virginia Cavaliers. The Cavaliers were the military arm, I guess, in a way. I don't really like that phrase, but it certainly the enforcement arm, if you will, of the Anglicans. These were the folks who went after the Baptists and persecuted them and arrested them arrested them. This is America, folks. This is America pre-Constitution. They were arresting and persecuting Baptists. Why? Because they were Baptists, not because they were doing anything, anti-American or anti-everything. They were doing it because they were Baptists, and Baptists were not Anglicans, nor were they Puritans or Quakers. We can't have that. The Baptists, by the way, tended to settle in the southern areas, particularly Georgia, along the way. You had, as I said, the Baptists. Then you had the Roman Catholics. Now, we don't think of America as being a Roman Catholic nation. It was 1960 before we ever elected a Roman Catholic president, John Kennedy. And in fact, in one of his more remarkable speeches, John Kennedy had to give a speech about how he was not going to follow the Pope. He was going to follow the Constitution. It's one of the best speeches, I think, ever given by a presidential candidate. I adore that speech. But Roman Catholics tended to settle in Maryland. Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony, and later as a state, it had Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, as its official religion. You had, as I said, the Baptists and non-conforming Protestants, people who didn't conform. Think of the non-denominational today, people who don't fit in anywhere else. And of course, there was another religion that was common in America, but not massive, and that, of course, was the Jews, who, along with the Catholics, faced very heavy discrimination everywhere in the country, except for Maryland, which Maryland, discriminated against the Jews, but everywhere the Jews found discrimination. And this would come into play later, of course, with the Danbury letter and stuff like that. And it just, not the Danbury letter, the Newberry congregation. The upshot of this was that every different religion tended to congregate together as Montesquieu had predicted, and thus created this smaller areas of republic that had something in common, this confederation in common, the United States of America, but at the same time weren't real open to anything else. And of course, there was one other issue that divided the United States in the pre-constitutional era, let's call it the Confederation era, and that, of course, was slavery. Slavery was seen by many in the North, the Puritans, the Quakers, as being just sinful. You don't have to look very far to find, even in the convention, those same arguments about whether we're going to permit slavery. How can we say we're free and liberty and proclaim liberty throughout the land if we're having slaves? Well, of course, the southern states didn't see it that way. The southern states saw it somewhat differently, as they needed that. And of course, the 35th Compromise, both under the Articles of Confederation and under the terms of the Constitution, made it clear that this was going to be an argument throughout things. Now, the states, as you know, are not as small as Montesquieu would have liked them to be. And Hamilton will absolutely rip into this. He'll point out the fact that the state of New York, in order to meet Montesquieu's definitions strictly, would have to be divided into something like 30 or 40 states in order to make it work. But the fact of the matter is that they were small enough, particularly in population. Their culture and history was identical, and in most cases their religiousness was pretty homogenous, that this did provide for a good protection of liberty, as it were. It did provide with this concept that we're going to be able to protect liberty, at least in this area, in this state. And if all 13 of us can do that, then we'll protect liberty across the board. Brutus has spent a month, the first month, 17 September to 18 October, reading, studying this Constitution as proposed, and he addresses this question of, is this the best way to protect liberty? Because if we're not protecting liberty, what difference does any of this make? He is very concerned because as he reads the Constitution, as originally put out there, not amended, what he sees is that this Constitution means to have one government. Even if it doesn't say it's going to be one government, it's going to subsume the states. He believes that the implied powers here point to that. This government, he writes, is to possess absolute and uncontrollable power, legislative, executive, and judicial, with respect to every object to which it extends. For by the last clause of Section 8, Article 1st, it is declared that, quote, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. How many of you have ever read that from that aspect of things? From that direction? Again, this is what I said to you a few weeks ago. When I started reading the Constitution, rereading it after reading Brutus, all of a sudden sentences fell differently. Article 1, Section 8 could be read to imply, because there's nothing that says it doesn't mean this, that the federal government is going to take over everything. Every department, every government, every department, and every office thereof. Think about that for just a second. Just let it rattle in your head for a moment and try to see it from, instead of 2022 conservative libertarian republicanism, try to see it from 1788, 1787 vision of Republican, this idea, the Montesquieuian ideas. He goes on to say, and this is somewhat lengthy, the powers of the general legislature extend to every case that is of the least importance. There is nothing valuable to human nature, nothing dear to free men, that isn't within the limit of this government's power as proposed. It has the authority to make laws which will affect the lives, the liberty, and the property, there's that phrase again, life, liberty, and property, of every man in the United States. Nor can the Constitution or the laws of any states in any way prevent or impede the full and complete execution of every power given. The legislative power is competent to lay taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. There is no limitation to this power unless you could say that the clause which directs the use to which those taxes and duties shall be applied may be said to be a limitation. But this is no restriction of the power at all. For by this clause they are to be applied to pay for the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. It's almost as if, in some ways, Brutus has acquired one of the seeing stones from the Lord of the Rings and has looked into the future and said, wait, there's no limit on this power. There's no limit to where this can go. They can do whatever they want. And simply by saying the common defense and general welfare of the United States, there's no limits on this. And when you say common defense, I think you have to argue that that includes the phrase national security. And how often have we seen in the last 30, 50 years that phrase invoked? This is in the interest of national security. And as Brutus said, that's no limit at all, is it? There's nothing here to stop these. He was most concerned, and I say most concerned, not me, I mean, he was deeply concerned, not most concerned, but deeply concerned with Congress is vested with the great uncontrollable power of laying and collecting these taxes, regulating trade, raising and supporting armies, organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. That's the state's issue, but all of a sudden Congress is taking over, instituting courts and other general powers, and are by this clause invested with the power of making all laws proper and necessary. He's gone back to that necessary and proper clause again, for carrying all these into execution. And they may so exercise this power as entirely to annihilate the state governments and reduce this country to one single government. Why does that matter? Because under his understanding of the proper size, scope, and function of a republic, the United States, even in 1787, is too big to do that. But moreover, he says, if they can do this, if they may do it, it's pretty certain that they will. For it will be found, listen to this very carefully, it will be found that the power retained by the individual states, small as it is, will be a clog upon the wheels of the government of the United States. The latter, therefore, will be naturally inclined to remove it out of the way. He believes, Brutus believes, having read the Constitution, he believes that the federal government is inevitably going to become so big and so massive and so powerful that it will eradicate the states. And remember that at this point there is no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. If you have no Bill of Rights, and if the government is therefore naturally inclined to remove the state governments out of the way, how will this possibly protect liberty? Can it? Well, now the Federalists, Hamilton, Madison, they certainly believe that it can. They argue that the limits and the power of the federal government in the Constitution are few and defined. And even that, they say, Madison says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But we got to have some government. And this is small and tight, and it will protect liberty. Praesidio Libertatis is the phrase in Latin. Defending liberty. Today, 2022, we believe that as conservatives, libertarian conservatives, the Constitution defends liberty. It's what we believe. It's what we say. It's what we preach. We want liberty. We want to. This is the Constitution. That's why we love the Constitution, because it protects our liberties. But it's pretty clear that Brutus would not have seen it that way, nor would most of the Anti-Federalists would not have seen it that way. In fact, what they would have seen and predicted was a giant monolithic federal government that subsumed the states and their authority. And by doing so, would become a non-Montesquieuing republic and not protect liberties. And over the next few weeks, we're going to learn why Brutus says this. And we're going to see even more reasons why he thought, and why many of the Anti-Federalists thought, that this Constitution was not good. Not good at all. And would inevitably lead, as he said, to the idea that this would become one tyrannic aristocracy. And that eventually liberty in the United States of America, the very thing for which we fought, the very thing for which we seek to preserve the blessings of, would be shut up and would become nothing more than a memory.